I don't even know how to identify, much less talk about the things that I'm really good at. I've just been doing this for so long. I'm just good at it. I mean, I have a sixth sense about things, which, and I'm not here to refute ESP. Maybe it is a real thing, but chances are you don't have a sixth sense. You've seen a lot of things. You're good at patterns. You have very sensitive antenna that's able to pick up on certain signals and cues, and therefore you have better judgment. The other challenge is a little bit stickier, which is actually I do know what makes me really special, but I see that as my currency. My know-how is something that I've built up from years and years of experience, and it's the thing that gives me status. It's the thing that's helped me build my reputation, and frankly, it's the thing that gives me job security too. And I'm a little reluctant to give that away because I don't trust where this is going, or I don't know where this is going. Maybe you're gonna use this to replace me. Maybe you're gonna try to download what's in my brain and give it to a bot, and I'm gonna be replaced by AI. That's a tougher one. So I think when you're having those conversations, you have to be really clear up front and say, look, first of all, we recognize that you're valuable for a lot of reasons, but this particular capability, you are a model. And we want other people to be able to follow this model that you already have demonstrated. And so this is not about replacing you. This is about scaling some of these skills because we see you as a leader in this area and we want to learn from you.
Hi there, I'm Denise Chaffin, and I am your podcast host for Talking TA. And today I have with me David Warren, who is the founder of Oomiyasa. Did I say that right?
Very good.
David has an amazing background working for companies like Zara and also Salesforce as a digital transformation director. David, welcome. I'd like you to go ahead and give us a little bit about your background, and we can launch into our conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate that, Denise. Yeah, so as you said, I have spent the last 10, 15 years involved in digital transformation. I think maybe the through line through my entire career could be summed up as I've been a consultant and a customer advisor. And most recently, I've been focused on the knowledge management space, specifically on tacit knowledge and helping companies harvest what their best people know best and make it available to everyone else.
Which is how I found you, your LinkedIn post. I mean, just some of the data that you included in that post, it was amazing. And again, to your background obviously lends itself to this discussion. So let's talk about that. Let's jump right in. What made you want to write that article?
This is something that I have been very interested in for a long time. I've carried a bag, I've carried a quota, I've sat through a lot of QBRs, a lot of postmortems and all hands. And usually in those forums you talk about what's working well so we can all benefit from it. But usually what happens is people start to share very platitudinal things, very high level examples of what went on with a deal or what went on with a customer or an engagement. And so the learning is not very specific and it's not very transferable. And while I think companies have gotten really good at managing things like, hey, let's document our processes and let's have our documentation and our content, they're not so good at tapping into what people have learned from their experience. So the things that make their judgment so good and cascading that throughout the rest of the organization, because I think that's where the real learning is. We've all been in situations where we're in a job and maybe we're facing a moment that's a little ambiguous. Maybe it's something we've never done before. And so the first question we ask is, hey, who around here has done this before? And more importantly, how did they do it here? Not how did they do it at some other company, but how did they do it here? Because this is new to me and I want to make sure that I'm successful at managing whatever it is that's sitting in front of me.
Do you think we'll start asking that question more? I mean, that is the most uh, underrated question, really, that we can ask right now.
I think people ask it all the time. I think the challenge is you spend a lot of time trying to find who has done this and how did they do it. And if it isn't documented, if it isn't in your Google Drive or somewhere in Slack, or if you just can't find the person that's done it before, you waste a lot of cycles just searching and searching and searching versus doing and getting it off your plate.
Okay, true. Yeah, let's talk about some of let's draw some parallels between hiring for valued skills because, one of the things too that we're talking about right now, and, besides finding people internally, how are we going to then kind of draw people into the organization with certain skills versus looking at a resume and saying, okay, well, this person worked at XYZ company and yeah, they had the right title. But when I read their resume, I'm not sure about their skills. And so, how are we going to start looking more for those skills versus looking at their past employers or even education background?
Right, and I imagine most of your audience knows this already, but I think it starts with a question, and the question is, what capabilities do we need more people to be reliably good at this year, right, or for the next 5 years? And there's 2 ways of attacking that. One is, well, let's build the capabilities of the people we have, and then also let's get some new people in the door that have these capabilities. I think rather than jumping right to the job description and the competency model, it's probably worth thinking about, well, who are the people in this organization today that already modeled those capabilities? And what is it that they are doing? And let's go have a conversation with them. And then when you have that conversation, instead of jumping into, hey, why are you so good at, I don't know, pick one, executive influence? What are your best practices? You ask someone about best practices, you tend to get a lot of platitudinal mush that isn't very specific and it isn't very transferable. So I think it's more helpful to ask questions like, tell me about the last time a conversation you were having with an executive almost went badly, but you were able to save it. And then really mine them for lots of details. How did you know things weren't going well? What were the options that you had in front of you? Which option did you go with? Why did you pick that option? Et cetera, and so forth. And then you start to get a little bit more details around how they think. And this is true both for a candidate that you might be interviewing internally to kind of understand, hey, who does this well here? But then you want to compare that with interviews that you're having with people that you're thinking about bringing into the organization. And sometimes it's even helpful to maybe script some of the people who are going to be doing some of the interviewing to make sure that those questions are being asked so you can compare and contrast how external people are doing that relative to how internal people are doing that today.
I love the idea of scripting. That is amazing, really, because I think that when we go into interviews, how many times have we heard as recruiters and practitioners in our space that you've got maybe 5 people who are going to do these interviews, right? And maybe there's a panel interview or they're individual interviews. But does interviewer one know what interviewer two is going to ask? I mean, are these scripted interviews? I think a lot of companies do that, but there's probably a lot that don't. They're kinda shooting from the hip, or they're just meeting somebody, or they got pulled into an interview because Julie couldn't show up or John couldn't show up for the interview, and they're pulling somebody else in the department who's unprepared for the interview, right? So there's that kinda stuff going on. So having scripts, I think, is amazing because, like you said, you could pull then some of that detail, some of those skills detail from the interview or the candidate who's interviewed for the position. One thing, though, that comes up for me on this, what about the people who don't want to share their inside knowledge on whatever it is we're talking about, influence or communication or whatever, their success stories, because they're maybe feeling a little territorial, a little guarded with their information? What are we gonna do there?
Yeah, so I think this probably applies more to people who you're trying to harvest wisdom from that are already employed. And you're right, there's 2 barriers that people tend to throw up. One is I don't even know how to identify, much less talk about the things that I'm really good at. I've just been doing this for so long, I'm just good at it. I mean, I have a sixth sense about things, which and I'm not here to refute ESP, maybe it is a real thing, but chances are you don't have a sixth sense, you've seen a lot of things, you're good at patterns, you have very sensitive antenna that's able to pick up on certain signals and cues, and therefore you have better judgment. So that's why asking competency questions, asking about specific events that have happened in the past will help them figure out what it is that is relevant and germane to the conversation. The other challenge is a little bit stickier, which is actually I do know what makes me really special, but I see that as my currency. My know-how is something that I've built up from years and years of experience, and it's the thing that gives me status. It's the thing that's helped me build my reputation, and frankly, it's the thing that gives me job security too. And I'm a little reluctant to give that away because I don't trust where this is going, or I don't know where this is going. Maybe you're gonna use this to replace me. Maybe you're gonna try to download what's in my brain and give it to a bot, and I'm gonna be replaced by AI. That was a tougher one. So I think when you're having those conversations, you have to be really clear upfront and say, look, first of all, we recognize that you're valuable for a lot of reasons, but this particular capability, you are a model. And we want other people to be able to follow this model that you already have demonstrated. And so this is not about replacing you. This is about scaling some of these skills because we see you as a leader in this area and we want to learn from you. That is not a guarantee that somebody is just all of a sudden going to open up the floodgates, but it's a better way to start.
Sure, you bet. Well, and it includes candidate conversations as well, because a candidate could come in and you could ask them specific questions like you're talking about, and they could say, well, gosh, if I give away the store now, they're not going to hire me.
Right. Yeah, so when you're asking a candidate about when you're mining for a particular skill and you're mining for their wisdom, you wanna set up the right context too. And sometimes it requires being a little transparent. So you might wanna say, "Look, this we are a very entrepreneurial, shoot from the hip type of culture, right? We're not about standardization and processes. We expect people to be able to recognize a problem and be very entrepreneurial with their approach. And that means living with a lot of ambiguity. Tell me about a time recently where you've had to deal with a lot of ambiguity, but you were still accountable for the results. What did you do? And where did it almost go wrong? So you've given them a couple of things that they can hang their hat on and give them a chance to be successful at responding with a story that's compelling and also helpful for you.
Do you think it's fair to share that question with candidates before they interview so that they're prepared for that question during the interview?
I think it can be. I think it's always good to hold back a few questions to see how they respond on their feet, especially if you're interviewing candidates that you expect are gonna be going in front of external stakeholders and customers. We all know that customers don't script their questions to salespeople before they get in front of them. So, yeah, I think it's good to keep a few questions to see how someone does and maybe gets a little off balance and then gets themselves back on track. Sure.
Yeah, I do too, because sometimes I feel like the candidates get nervous when they maybe later on, because I have asked candidates questions that they weren't expecting. And then later on, they'll come back to me and say, I thought of another answer to that question after we finished the interview. So sometimes I think, to your point, yes, it's good to hold back on some questions, but others that might make a difference for them in whether or not they move forward to the next set of interviews or or an offer, it might be good to work with the team and say, "Hey, which questions do we want them to know ahead of time that they're gonna be asked?" I mean, if you look at people in sales or marketing, they're asked to bring presentations with them and to give a presentation of something that they've done in the past, right? So I think in fairness to candidates in other areas, it might be fair to share with them some of the questions, and also, I always like to share with them who they're gonna interview with, and I tell them, "Make sure you go and you research the people you're gonna interview with so that you understand where they were beforehand." Because I think oftentimes too, and I share this with candidates constantly, the questions that you ask us are as important as the questions that we're gonna ask you. And I think that it gives them a more fair advantage that they do have knowledge of who they're gonna interview with and have an opportunity to look at the background of the people they're gonna interview with, and because there might be some common information there, companies they've worked for, people they've worked with, or so there might be some common ground, but yeah, I like this conversation. I think
Yeah,
it's
I think there's also a maybe a midway point that could be helpful where maybe you give the candidate some clue as to here's a typical use case someone in your position is going to have to deal with. or here's the scenario that a lot of folks in this role find themselves in. So just be aware of that and be thoughtful about it. But then you can still hold back some questions and say, listen, when you're in a scenario like this, like the one I told you about before you came and interview, how do you know when something is going wrong? Oh, well, that might not be something that they anticipated, but it does force them to think about what are the cues and the signals that I look for to know what is the current health of the situation that I'm already in.
I love that question. Where do you think this could go wrong? Or where yeah, where do you see this possibly going wrong? That's a great question. Or yeah. So I think the questions that we need to create as recruiters and talent acquisition practitioners, I think are gonna be just huge in and bringing in the skills that we're talking about right now versus the credentials from, like I said, former employers or education. And so let's talk about education for a minute. Where do you see us heading, especially now with I keep hearing from a lot of people, candidates, people who are family members of candidates who are looking for positions, especially parents who have kids graduating from college. Their kids can't find work. They're looking, they're having issues with finding positions in their chosen profession from college. Where do we see the education cycle heading now?
So see it in a couple of places. So depending on which podcast you listen to or what columnists you follow, you might hear, "Hey, don't take computer science anymore. Computer science is dead. Everything that it teaches is going to be replaced by AI in the next, 15 days," right? Depending on how hysterical the writer is. We are seeing a lot of people going back to the trades right now. So the stuff that technology can't replace, there's a shortage of carpenters right now. There's a shortage of plumbers. There's a shortage of engineers, but more the physical engineers right now. And those jobs are paying pretty well. There was an article today, I think in the Wall Street Journal, maybe the New York Times, where Ford is looking for people that can replace transmissions, and a master technician can make up to $160,000 a year. Right. So in the past, while the world has told high school graduates, "Hey, get a college or there's really no future for you," I think now it's being balanced out with the message that, hey, there are other options and there are other paths besides higher education. Trade schools are not cheap, but you could get a faster return on what you're gonna learn there than you might by going to a premier elite university.
It's interesting that there was and I mentioned this before, there was a kid that I spoke with recently who wants to become a machinist. And he said, I want to become a machinist and have my own machining company because there's no lack of opportunity and you can become a machinist for any industry. It's not industry specific. I thought that was, and I mean, he's maybe 20, 21 years old. I thought that was pretty brilliant. And then his girlfriend wanted to become a fire chief. So she wants to go work for the fire department. So there are some conversations now, I think, away from our typical 4-year college university degree programs that are happening more now. I
The
agree.
3 types of jobs that have always been in demand going back centuries is you either know how to build something, you know how to sell something, or you know how to fix something.
There you
You do
go.
one of those 3 really well, you'll always have a roof over your head and food on your table.
You know how to build something, you know how to fix something. Oh, sell something and you know how to fix something. Oh, I love that. Build, sell, fix. Okay, I gotta keep that one up here. That is great. So, David, let's talk about offboarding. You had mentioned to me that we're great at offboarding as employers,
Well,
right?
I would say we are in the middle of a great offboarding right now. So, during the pandemic, we saw a lot more job hopping, and I think now we're seeing a lot more job hugging, and despite that, companies are seeing a bigger exit, a faster exit of employees than at any other time in the past. And a lot of that's being driven obviously by the retirement cliff, and baby boomers are retiring every day, more and more of them, but you're also seeing a lot more layoffs. And so, depending on if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, if you're a company of 1,000 people today, in 2030, only 400 of those 1,000 people are probably still going to be working with you. And the median tenure for an employee in these companies is around 3.9 years, under 4 years. It's the lowest it's been in a long time. which means that a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom is walking out the door. And if you aren't focused on trying to capture it and retain it, so you can replace some of these people that are leaving, whether you're going to do it through AI, you're going to do it with another human being, you're going to be at a loss and you're going to be spending a lot of time catching up and or getting surprised, unpleasant surprises by the people that you once had that could head off any of those unpleasant surprises.
Wow, that's a good point. That's a huge point. So what do we need to do to before we let people walk out the door? What do we need to do to understand whether or not they're still a valuable asset to our business, and what are we gonna do to keep them?
I think that there's a few options. So companies, especially large companies, they put a lot of effort into, well, we need to standardize our processes and we need to make sure that all the content that's out there in the world is searchable and findable and shareable and usable. But then there's the more tacit knowledge stuff. And depending on what your role is, some companies have set up communities of practice, right? Where people will get together routinely, may not be mandated, and they'll get together and they'll share a critique of each other's work. They'll talk about what they're working on. They might even show work that they're doing. And people who are more experienced or even less experienced might bring a skilled or a beginner's mind to the table and offer feedback, and thus everybody will improve. And communities of practice, they've been around for a long time. They work really well, but only typically for certain groups. So designers, for example, anybody who has a design background is probably involved in some sort of community of practice. Developers, coders, people who see their job as a craft tend to get a lot out of those types of communities of practice. But other positions like salespeople, maybe not so much. Like salespeople tend to have their calendars dictated to them by when a customer needs them, right? Or where are we in the quarter right now? I got to focus on my deals. So it's hard to actually get people to come together. And you also need a really strong facilitator to make sure that these conversations are worthwhile. But some form of community of practice, whether it's physical or whether it's more synthetic and digital, is something that I think companies could probably benefit from. They just may have to think creatively around how they execute it.
Are there tools? Is there software and tools for this to help create this community of practice?
I feel a little guilty saying this because I come from the software world, but I am convinced that 99% of the companies out there don't need to buy more software. And by the same token, they probably don't need to buy another methodology and they don't need to buy more programs. Most companies have enough software, they have enough programs, they have enough methodologies to keep them in good stead for many, many years, but they may need better data. So is there a way to actually, going back to this notion of harvesting wisdom, if you're having intentional conversations with people around the capabilities that you want to drive in the organization, extract it, but then rather than putting it in another tool or putting it into a document or a deck that never gets shown or seen, plug it into those training materials that you have right now, those onboarding materials, the interview scripts that you're using to bring in new talent. So you're infecting the organization with the wisdom of people that came before them, and it lives on because they keep bumping into it over and over, no matter where they turn.
I love that, infecting the organization with the wisdom of the people that have come before them. That is awesome. I love that. You've got some great one-liners. Let's talk about I mean, with respect to this conversation, let's talk about now too the gaps, because as well as offboarding too many people and keeping those amazing employees who can help share some of the wisdom that the company needs to keep in house. How do we go about finding what those gaps are? Because they're the proficiency gaps before we even kind of launch into who to keep and how to keep them and that type of thing.
Um, I can think back to a few examples where this has popped up, and one that's probably the most frustrating is when a leader says, I feel like we just don't know what makes us successful when we are successful because we keep running into the same challenge over and over again, and we don't know how to solve it." And to me, that is a symptom of a type of gap, and it's more of a contextual gap. It is a judgment gap because we have been successful in the past. Maybe the person that helped make us successful is no longer here because we don't have the benefit of that experience. So again, I go back to being very intentional about what is the capability that we need to spread throughout the organization this year to make sure that we don't have that gap. And let's go find and spend some time with the people that are already modeling that capability.
And also, I think that you and I discussed this. I've had this conversation before, and it's coming up more and more. So, if we do have gaps, though, and our internal teams are not able to fill those gaps or those areas, those lags, if you would, between the skills, what about the contractors that we bring in and new employees? And also, are we going to interview contractors who have specific skills for some of these gaps? Are we gonna interview them differently than we would an employee?
I don't know why you would, except maybe one consideration would be if you think about ramp up time. Because when it comes to, I mean, there are 2, there's lots of metrics, but there's probably 2 main metrics that wisdom can improve, and one is proficiency, but I think the other one is time to proficiency. And so if you have a contractor that you're bringing in, the expectation is that contractor is gonna know how to know, and they're gonna know how to know really, really quickly so they can start delivering value. But if the ramp up time takes 2 to 3 months, you're paying for that contractor to learn, and you may not wanna spend all your resources educating someone who really is only supposed to come in for maybe 6 months total, be able to deliver value, and then move on to the next project. So, you wanna be able to give them enough context up front and help them understand, what are the dynamics of this organization? How do things work? How are decisions made around here? What's the criteria we're going to be using to evaluate whatever work you're going to be delivering? And who typically does really well in these environments, whether it was a previous employee or a previous contractor. So you have to work a little bit harder to get that contractor up to speed, but it will pay dividends if you're willing to make that investment up front.
Not only that, but oftentimes contractors are converted to full-time employees if that's what they wanna do. I'm seeing more people, though, who are interested in developing an LLC and working as a fractional or a contract employee versus going in-house. I'm hearing a lot more of that right now. Are you?
I am too. Some of that I believe is being driven just by kind of the employment landscape right now. We're in January 2026, so a lot of companies have closed the books on 2025. In the tech world, it's probably gonna be another month or 2. So companies have been holding back, they wanna get the books closed, and then they're going to make another assessment and see what's going on with tariffs, what's going on internationally right now, what's going on with the labor market and interest rates. So if a change is going to happen, we probably won't see it for another 1 or 2 quarters. I'm not an economist, so don't hold me to that. Uh, but I think that's also going to make the determination. First of all, are employers gonna start to hire again? And are some of those folks with an LLC going to jump back into the job market? Or are they gonna hold on to that small business and try to grow what they have?
And now, and are they gonna be harder, though, to convince to share some of their tacit wisdom with the companies that they're contracting for?
If you're a company that's looking for someone that's very entrepreneurial, that's very proactive, there's probably no better candidate than someone who's started their own business, who knows how to do a lot of things. They know how to market, they know how to sell, they know how to create a value proposition, they know how to deliver great customer service and success. So your time to proficiency for someone like that might actually be much shorter, and so you'll probably get a faster return on hiring someone like that. Then the question becomes the candidates that you're looking at that have that experience, are you willing to offer them enough that they're willing to walk away from whatever it is they've built thus far?
Ah, that's interesting. That's a very good point. Very good point. I'm wondering too, going back to contractors, because I am hearing more people talk about fractional work, especially in the HR and talent acquisition space, because since the market has been so flat over the last couple of years, people are saying, how long am I going to wait here for something new to land in my lap? And I need to go out and do something. And so they're taking on these smaller projects just to kind of keep work going. And they're like, I've had a few people say, I kind of like it. I like the autonomy. I like having the flexibility to work for who I want to work for. Yeah, I have to beat the pavement more in order to kind of keep the contracts coming in and let people know that I'm looking, that type of thing. But at the end of the day, it's not such a bad deal, especially now that the return to office mandate has kind of peaked up again, right? Because oftentimes contractors can work remotely or at least hybrid, more so than employees. And in fact, it's really funny. We have a client who had a talent acquisition manager position open, and then they wound up hiring somebody who is a contractor, and she's only there 3 days a week because she said, "Hey, I'm happy to come in and share my wisdom with you and to share my experience and help you guys get things kinda rolling here. But I also have these new projects I've just taken on, and I want to continue working on those." They were fine with it. They canceled their full-time requisition and brought her in as a 3-day-a-week contractor. So I think it's really interesting to kind of see this dynamic, right? But at the same time, she's even said herself, I'm not going to go in there though and give away the store. If they want to keep me on as a contractor, I'm going to come in and do the work they're asking me to do. But as far as training people to do what I do and what I know, I don't know. I may be a little bit cagey about doing something like that.
At the risk of sounding a little sarcastic here, I think a lot of this comes down to labeling. Am I a solopreneur? I'm a contractor. I'm a freelancer. I'm fractional. I mean, essentially, the work is sort of the same. At least it's very closely related. But I think you're right, and I've talked to other people like myself, other solopreneurs, and their way about getting business is actually to go on LinkedIn, look at the job postings, find the hiring manager, and say, I know you're looking for a full-time employee. However, I actually offer a service around this and would be happy to talk to you about something that actually might be more economical for you and might get you a faster return on your dollar by just hiring me as a contractor. And some of them have been very successful with that because sometimes there's a very explicit need that's very clear in the mind of the hiring manager, um, that only exists maybe the next 3 to 6 months, but there isn't a lot of clarity around, "And then what? What am I gonna have what am I gonna have this person do after that?"
That's interesting. I have heard that education is for some reason, education is supposed to be up this year. Healthcare, manufacturing, there's a few areas, but high tech has not been one of them, not for the last couple of years.
No, high tech has been due for a reckoning for some time, and I think it's been paying its dues for the last 2 years, probably especially since 2022, we saw a dip, we saw another one in 2024, and it's continued, and a lot of that's being driven, obviously, by this tension that's created through software and AI, and there's a whole debate around, are we gonna see the death of software? Is it all gonna be replaced by AI? I think it's gonna be something that's in the middle, but that picture is not clear. There's been a ton of investment, obviously, in AI. There's a whole circuitous economy around that. And so until the dust settles, where the next wave of investment goes or comes from is it still isn't very clear. But I agree, there are still industries that are always going to be in demand. You're going, as you said, there's healthcare and manufacturing. We're still going to need to go to the doctor and take care of ourselves. We're still going to need things that get built, whether it's done in this country or in other countries. And then there's also the consumables, right? There's the things that we are always going to need to keep ourselves fed and clothed. So there may be some more hiring. The question is, will the hiring and will the salaries be able to replace some of the jobs that have gone away from some of those other sectors, such as IT and high tech?
Oh, that's true too. That's true. And for companies who want to hire the people either as contractors or as employees because they have these gaps going back to that, I think it's gonna be important too for them to understand the future of their organization. And you mentioned they don't need to buy new software. They need to kind of work with what they have and kind of reevaluate where their gaps are and what they're gonna need to do.
There has been a lot of ink that's been spilt on this notion of reskilling, and I think at every level, both for white collar workers and for blue collar workers and for tradespeople as well. But the question is, what should I reskill on? It was only maybe 12, 18 months ago that everyone was talking about the future of prompt engineering, where you wouldn't need to learn how to code, but you'd need to learn how to work with some GPT agent to create software. We no longer hear about prompt engineering because now the understanding is actually you don't need to work that hard. You could put in one prompt and you can get the software that you're going to need produced auto magically by AI. So even things like strategic planning. I was just talking to someone recently that said, "Oh, yeah, I'm in the middle of doing my 5-year plan." And my response was, "Companies still do that? 5-year plan? The world is gonna look so different in 1 year. How could you possibly plan for a 5-year time horizon?" Because companies right now, they've gotten so reactive because so much has happened so fast, it's really hard to think about, well, where are we going to make the investment? Which includes who are we going to need to hire and what are the capabilities that we're going to need in 18 months, not just tomorrow.
Oh my gosh. What was the response?
As always, it's really clear what we're gonna be doing in the next year, but anything beyond 2 or 3 years is really just a guess.
It is. I wonder if it's that way for for all industries and organizations. Hmm.
Well, you brought up education as well, and obviously higher ed has been taking its lumps in the last couple of years, in the last couple of months. Tuition is still going up, and I think there's a real question around what are we going to prioritize when it comes to how we budget, who are the students that are gonna be able to afford tuition in the future, and are we going to do anything about that?
Right. So let's talk about some of the should be obvious benefits of harvesting tacit wisdom from people, either employees, existing employees, candidates, contractors, whoever we're going to solicit that wisdom from. What are some of the benefits besides retention?
Retention is obviously one. We've talked about proficiency. We've talked about time to proficiency. I think it also helps your culture in a couple of ways. One, if I know that I'm being recognized for something that I'm not just good at because I have experience and skills, but it's the way I think, it's the way I look at problems, it's the way I engage with customers, which is then going to create this halo effect around me and draw other people to me and may lead to a promotion and the ability to teach and guide others. That's very honoring of your employees, and that's a great place to be as a culture. I think also it lends itself to more innovation because if you're the type of company that is has a discipline of curiosity around how do people work and how do people think and even how do people two people who are very successful would approach things in different ways, being able to compare and contrast and identify, hey, what is our way of doing things? What is our way of introducing new value? That's also really helpful. But you have to have that transparency first, which means people have to trust that they can share the way that they're thinking, the judgment that they're exercising, the mistakes that they're making too, so they can learn from it. And so everybody can benefit from that.
I would imagine it would increase margins too, profit margins. When you've got people sharing information internally and feeling like you said, feeling like they're in a culture or a community of people internally where they can trust others with the information that they're sharing with them.
Yeah, one thing we haven't talked about this yet, but as you're doing your going through your harvesting exercise, what often comes up with someone who's trusting their interviewer is maybe a workaround or a shortcut that they executed that maybe didn't even follow process. Or maybe I went around someone and I got information from someone else that I don't typically use and neither does someone else in my organization. That's a tell. So if the process that you've put forward is not optimized for that person, and one of your best performers is saying, actually, I don't follow step 4 and 5. I do this because it's faster and it's better. Rather than punishing that person for being out of compliance, assuming that they're not hurting anybody or breaking any laws, that might be a cue to you to rethink your process and maybe simplify things or change things so others can be as successful and work more efficiently. And to your point, improve margin because it's taking you less effort, less time, less dollars to drive value for the company.
Definitely. What a great conversation. One thing that you had mentioned to me when we first spoke, you said that every company should ask this question. What capabilities do you want to drive and improve in your organization? And I think that we've kind of discussed it a little bit, but that's really kind of, I think, the first step a lot of companies need to really take and look at. Because again, for proficiencies, gaps to fill, any number of things. And then too, going back on education, you're talking about software. So one of my neighbors owns a software company. And he said, and you made a good point about the software industry. And he said that one of the areas that he sees as a gap right now is software testing and quality. He said, because we can basically, like you mentioned, use AI to do a lot of our programming now and a lot of our development work. But now they're looking for people who have to do testing on what AI is creating, right? So now you can have a whole new set of skills. And so we are talking about education. And I said, throughout my career as a recruiter, I've always told people if you want just to get even just a math degree or an English degree, those are two degrees that you can use forever that you can actually elevate. So a math degree alone, and he even agreed. He said, yeah, he said, that's a good point. He said, because we don't really need to worry about what kind of software engineering or development skills that we have right now. Because like you mentioned, things are going to change anyway over the next year to 5 years. And we don't know how AI is going to land in that particular space. But for people who do want the 4-year degree, a simple math degree might work for right now and they can add on it, they can build on it and take other courses and whatnot. But as far as the software business, it is gonna change, and it's going to change dramatically, and I hear that from people who are in software. I honestly have never in my life had so many people who are software developers contact me as I get right now. I always had to go after them, and now the shoe's on the other foot. They're coming looking for positions because they're not recognizing the need for their own particular area. What are some of the other capabilities do you think that people need to be looking for when they're talking about improving their organization or driving for their organization besides like IT or some of the engineering areas? What are some of the other key gaps that you're seeing?
I can sum it up in one word, and that word would be orchestration. I think it there's a lot of different flavors to it, but to give a little bit of hope to the software developers who might be kind of searching and feeling a little bit lost, they need to give themselves a little bit of credit because one thing software developers are really good at is orchestration, and not just of code, but very often they're working with other developers, they're working with someone who's doing quality assurance, they're working with some product manager that's breathing down their necks and saying, "I need this feature out tomorrow." So they're already managing a lot of different stakeholders. They may not be responsible ultimately for the final products, but they're aware of it. And so if you think about extending your ability to orchestrate, to balance, to prioritize, to read signals, in the future, you may have employees that are flesh and blood. You may have employees that are agents. You may have employees that are bots, and you may have employees that are outside of your organization, and you're going to have to learn how to orchestrate that. And developers already have an innate ability that they've learned over time around how to balance the needs of all these different stakeholders. But what your stakeholder looks like in the future may change. It may not, some of them may not be human. One other thing I would add to something that you said is while it's very true that it's important to ask the question, what's the capability that we need to build out this year? I think you also want to make sure that you have a follow up question around, and how will we know when we got there? What's the metric that we're going to look at? Because chances are you're going to get it wrong a couple of times, but at least you're going to give yourself a chance to track something and know that you're wrong before the end of the year comes. So if you need to make an adjustment, or if you need to introduce some more training, or maybe you need to go investigate another capability and go harvest wisdom around that. What that is that you need to fill that gap.
Oh, that is such a good point, David. Oh my gosh, that is such a great point. And I like the orchestration part of it because for people and again, our audience mostly is TA practitioners. For people who are working with software developers and people in that space, IT, software development, besides the quality and testing and whatnot, I mean, if they can look at almost taking their skills, their orchestration skills, and aligning those skills to some of the positions that might open up. I mean, have you heard about any orchestration type positions that might be opening?
They've existed forever. I mean, people talk about Scrum, right? And like the role of Scrum Masters, right? This is a legacy role. It's existed for a long time. I think there will always be some flavor of that. But as I said, the number of people, the types of stakeholders you're going to have, I think it's probably going to expand. And the capabilities are going to expand too. The expectations are going to expand. You may not just be dealing with other IT folks. You may deal with a little bit more marketing. You might have the chief revenue officer asking you questions around, hey, we have some data. We'd really like to sell this new feature in the next 3 to 4 months. What would need to happen to be able to get that out the door? Right. And so you need to have a business conversation with that person and be able to speak in a language that someone in sales is going to understand, not just someone who has a technology background.
And that brings up a good point. Business analysts. We've been talking about business analysts more lately as well, and how they are almost like that liaison between the IT and the business units. So we may see more of those positions opening up where people who have been on the development side could maybe transition into more of a business analyst role.
Yeah, I mean, in the probably the last 10 or 15 years, we saw the rise of the specialist. So someone that knew a lot about a particular industry or somebody knew a lot about a function or a piece of technology. They were and still are really, really valuable. Um, my hypothesis is we may see the rebirth of the generalist who is able to speak many different languages to many different stakeholders because it's unlikely that you're just going to want to create one technology for one particular segment or one particular industry and grow forever. You're going to need to be able to expand and sell to multiple technologies or maybe just personas and segments. And so you're going to need to be a generalist to be able to think about how can I take this feature or this value proposition and make it relevant to a completely different buyer or customer.
Wow. That is such a good point. Huh. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. Very good point. Well, thank you. I appreciate this. So let me ask you a final question here. Moving forward, how can people reach you, especially people who might need your expertise in helping them define what their gaps are and their proficiencies that they need to look for and what capabilities they're looking to drive for their company?
Yeah, if anyone's interested in the topic of wisdom harvesting or tacit knowledge management, I can be found in the usual channels. So LinkedIn is probably the best place. You can go to umiyasa.com or you can email me at david@umiyasa.com.
Well, what does Oomiyasa stand for?
So Oomiyasa is a word that was created by my oldest daughter when she was 3 years old. I don't know what it means, but I think it means good stuff because she used it to describe everything that she liked, whether it was Barbie movies or dresses or chicken nuggets. If it was good, it was Oomiyasa. And so
Oomiyasa.
we've
Oh.
I've I pay her a royalty of $1 a year to use it for the name of the company.
Okay, that's fabulous. I love it. That's a great story. David, thank you. So this has been seriously an eye-opening conversation, and I hope it is for our audience as well. Because if there are just, this is such a new conversation we're having right now about tacit wisdom and how to capitalize on it with our current employees or people who come into the organization. So, thank you so much. I really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Denise.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Bye.